I'm Tony Remus, and this is Tony Talks Back. Adam Smith. That's about as generic an old-timey name as you can possibly get. But I assure you, the Scotsman Adam Smith was anything but ordinary. Modern economics owes itself to this man's philosophizing about the nature of human existence, specifically existence within the context of a market. His magnum opus was titled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or, more simply, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. An important year on multiple fronts. Now, please keep in mind while listening, I am no economist. I'm not really a numbers guy in general. The focus for me is not on the economics, but the philosophy of a market system. The market itself was no new invention when Adam Smith came along. Essentially, a market consists of a buyer of something, some material good or perhaps a service performed for them, and a seller of that good or service. One party supplies, the other demands. Not demand as in, you must give this to me, however. A market in which the parties are required to trade is not really a market at all. That's what free trade is all about. The parties to the trade have the choice not to participate, but more on that later. Trade is facilitated by money, currency systems being the backbone on which markets are built. I'll leave it to history buffs to more finely detail ancient trades and currencies and their various rises and falls, and if Adam Smith's brief history of currency holds up to current historical understanding. But trade has been integral to humanity for a very, very long time. It's a human universal. The French fur traders, for example, met with Native Americans all along the Great Lakes region. And these separate and radically different groups of people didn't just wipe each other out and take each other's stuff. They exchanged goods, knowledge, technology. Granted, not always peacefully. I don't intend to view history through a rose-tinted glass. But the historical record is clear that the French fur trade, insofar as it was a trade, was a peaceable and free exchange of goods and services between groups taken as equals. How is it possible that two groups of people, separated culturally for potentially thousands of years, could agree to trade? Could agree on anything? And do you know that's just one of countless examples of different cultures exchanging goods and services? Somehow, I don't know if it's biological or psychological, but somehow, humans know how to trade, innately. And it was only natural that we should develop over time a global trade, a global market, a global economy. Of course, no one really knew how it worked back then, and if you ask an economist today how the global economy functions, I bet they'll tell you much the same. It's an old machine, with shiny new parts and functionality, but the market is essentially humanity's natural state. Market theory, in Adam Smith's time, was dominated by an economic philosophy known as mercantilism. The core focus of a mercantilist system is on material products. The underlying thought goes that there is a finite amount of stuff in the world, and in order to gain more stuff, one must maximize the amount of stuff coming into your market, country, whatever, and minimize the amount of stuff going out. Short of waging war, taxes on imports and exports, known as tariffs, were basically the best way to quote-unquote win in this system. Mercantilism had not been without its critics. John Locke proposed in his second treatise of government that by joining labor to a property in the state of nature, a man increases the value of that property and also makes it rightfully theirs. This forms the philosophical basis for property rights. Very important that, you can be assured, property rights will come up later. John Locke thereby planted the seed that goods are not fully intrinsically valuable, because an outside force exerting labor on them can increase their value. Yet, countries were still engaging in mercantilist practices after John Locke's time. The labor theory of value was not satisfactory, both because it was not well formed at the time of John Locke and because it seemed to miss something fundamental about value. Karl Marx, the German economist, famously wrote about the labor theory of value and used it to justify some pretty radical conclusions. For example, that capital generated from labor should all go to the laborer, or else it is stolen wealth. Obviously a ridiculous statement when considering that in a truly capitalist society, you are free to enter and leave contracts exchanging your labor on the free market. But that's just the kind of person Marx was. But back to the subject at hand, Marx was, after all, a much later philosopher than Adam Smith. Back in Smith's time, you had countries like France and Great Britain engaging in high-tariff trade wars with each other. A mercantilist system necessarily restricts the freedom to trade with it and inside it in order to win the trade war. The fact of these limitations on what people can trade for implies that some supplies that could have met some demands will not be allowed to. And for Adam Smith, this was the biggest mistake a government or society could make. Let me chime in for a moment with the voice of reasonability. Of course, there are and have been reasonable restrictions on trade of all kinds, notably, for example, the slave trade. Slavery was in the process of being abolished in Great Britain during Smith's time, and Adam Smith was actually a huge advocate for its abolishment. For practical reasons, humans are naturally more productive when they are free. So goes his thinking. And therefore, slavery is not only morally wrong, but practically counterproductive. Adam Smith was not arguing for an anarchical market, where any trade goes. Rather, within the confines of the rights granted to each individual in society. To prevent a trade, one must refer to the violation of those individual rights in order to prevent it. Otherwise, people should be allowed to buy and sell what they want. So Adam Smith went on the offensive against mercantilism. He built up the idea that the value of an object does not lie within the material itself, but in the subjective value of the good to the buyer. Specifically for Smith, the amount of work it would save for the buyer. This was a much more useful way of looking at value. It incorporated the utility of a good or service, and though it isn't the full picture, it is still largely in line with modern economic outlooks concerned primarily with preferences. In essence, if you can produce things that people want to buy, then you're going to be more wealthy, and your goods and services more valued. Thus, having a variety of specialized skills producing, in Smith's case, labor-saving value, is how nations gain their wealth. The wealth of nations is not a zero-sum game. That is, what benefits one country does not have to hurt another. The fact of groups being able to trade freely can lead to a benefit on both sides of the agreement, because we, in our own individual and societal ways, are specialized to create certain goods and services better or more efficiently than other people and cultures. And this anti-mercantilist position makes a lot of sense even today. Take a country like Singapore or Japan that are, shall we say, lacking in natural resources. Singapore imports something like half its water supply from Malaysia, and yet these are some of the richest countries in the world. Why? You would think this would put Singapore at a major disadvantage. Well, Singapore has a free market. Free markets naturally fill supply and demand. Of course, specialization requires a certain level of general knowledge and education, but in principle and in practice, general education improves with the general state of the market. All of this is to say, the free market encourages and grows innovation, human innovation, which is the raison d'etre, the ultimate aim of humanity. Maybe not spiritually or rationally, but biologically, humans were made to innovate. Put us in a situation where we have to innovate or die, and we will solve any problem, climb any mountain. You can count on that. Become a patron of Tony Talks Back and get exclusive access to bonus content and a private RSS feed where you can download episodes and listen on your favorite podcast platform ad-free. Go to patreon.com/TonyTalksBack or click on the link down below. All right, that was a brief history of time in the market. Now let me sing you the praises of the philosophy itself, capitalism. In a modern context, capitalism entails private ownership. You can own land, and you can own the property on your land. This, of course, draws heavily from John Locke and property rights. Your labor and the things which you produce with it are yours. And while your labor is not, strictly speaking, the same thing as your land, your labor can be traded as capital, as money, for land or any other good or service you desire. Capitalism, and indeed all trade, functions because people desire things they don't have, that other people have, and that they are not willing or able to go to war to acquire those things. And the best part is that you get to keep what's yours. That is so important, an often overlooked benefit of our modern age. In an absolute monarchy, for example, the ruler can take away your land, your property, for whatever reason, whenever they want to. You have no security. You could work for 50 years building your home, but without the protection of property rights, there's no guarantee you get to keep it. And anarchy and/or mob rule offer no protection of the fruits of your labor. It's tragic, really, when we see people lose that which they've spent a lifetime working for. Speaking of tragedy, it's tempting to describe the capitalist market in opposition to the planned market, the capitalist economy versus the command economy. I suspect we will spend plenty of time on those subjects and the various doctrines they crawl out from. For now, a brief overview of a command economy. Instead of private ownership, the governing body, the collective, etc., own what is typically called the means of production. The collective decides what to produce and when. It's generally been a miserable failure everywhere it's been tried, and even so-called communist China has moved away from a pure command economy to a mixed economy. Why do these systems fail? Simply because they restrict free trade. They restrict the ability for humans to innovate and fill gaps in supply and demand. Don't get me wrong, capitalism has its issues as well. Power tends to accumulate at the top, which should be said is completely normal in any human endeavor. Redistribution of that power is something of a contentious issue, and a hard problem to solve. Property rights are natural rights. The motivation to leave people's rights alone is strong, and ideally those at the top would recognize if and when they should give back, so to speak. However, the accumulated power at the top can threaten to turn into a monopoly if left unchecked. Teddy Roosevelt was a rough-riding and awesome US president who famously busted the trusts. That is, he broke up the big monopolies, contributing to the Gilded Age of American history. Now, one might ask, why bother? Isn't that the goal of the board game Monopoly? To amass wealth in the hands of a single entity until they own everything and win? No. Well, yes, that is the goal of the game Monopoly. But no, that is not the goal of modern capitalism. The goal, the fundamental philosophy or ethos of capitalism is freedom of choice. Every agent in capitalism should be free to choose the contracts in which they participate. And if they choose to not participate, it lends itself to human innovation to give that agent an alternative option. Perhaps there is a best option, a most efficient way to get that which you desire. But if you object to that option for whatever reason, there should be a way around it. And it may be that the only other way is to innovate a path to your desired goal yourself. A monopoly would stand in the way of the path that you forge. That is not to say the mere fact of the existence of a sole provider of a good or service constitutes a monopoly. In practice, that often is the case with cutting-edge technologies. To be classified as a monopoly, those creators must also be engaged in preventing others from being able to achieve what they achieved using similar methods. Society does not owe you the work required to forge an alternative path, but it does owe you a path free of obstacles intentionally placed there by those that came before. Hence the trust-busting of Teddy. Companies acting in an anti-competitive manner are antithetical to our innate human innovation. To draw an example, land ownership is, for one, a natural right of yours, but if you are hoarding land, it is also stifling the right of others to make use of land and innovate with it. Adam Smith was critical of landlords engaging in monopolistic practices. Like all other things, there should be a competitive market for places to live. If you are going to be a landlord, you must compete in the landlord market. Or else innovation dies and land stagnates. That's actually part of the justification for property taxes, so that there is pressure for land under someone's ownership to not just sit idly by. President Roosevelt, by the way, also created the National Park System of America, regarded by many as one of the best in the world. Critics of capitalism, especially environmentalist-leaning types, will point to pollution and claim destruction of nature as the end game of the free market. But I just don't see the truth to that. We as a species are pretty good about keeping our collective living spaces in order. And it's true there is pollution currently concentrated in urban areas, such as in China. There used to be terrible pollution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But if you ever visit Pittsburgh, you'll notice that there isn't the infamous pollution anymore. Human innovation has time and time again lent itself to the benefit of all humanity, and I suspect that even cultures radically different from America will set reasonable boundaries on the subject in time. But it does take time for these ideas to manifest and take hold, especially when countries are still developing or just entering the industrial phase of their development. One must have some amount of empathy and patience with cultures and societies perhaps decades behind the current pinnacle. Long story short, the environment is a valid concern, and I believe people, regardless of origin, recognize that fact enough to allow reasonable limitations on what they each can do. With all its faults, capitalism remains the single greatest collective human achievement. Far too often I see people bashing on capitalism online, on the internet. How about some praise for this? Over 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty in the last 2 decades. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty has dropped from 60% in the 1960s to only approximately 10% today. That's incredible. That's amazing. Jolly well done, capitalism. And today we enjoy a collective standard of living simply unimaginable to even our recent ancestors. We have literal magic at our fingertips. The collective knowledge of humanity easily accessible to all with an internet connection and a consistently rising global standard of living. And thanks to the very foundations of our systems, built on freedom of choice. It is simply humanity's way forward. I'm Tony Remus. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, like, subscribe, review, wherever you're listening. Share it with your friends, and become a patron on Patreon, or consider a one-time donation on PayPal. Take it easy.